Tonight, the world grows quiet. The noise of the day fades, and the old stories begin to breathe again. Welcome to Narrative Nights, a place where ancient myths are not told in haste, but allowed to unfold slowly, like dreams remembered in the dark. Here we walk beside forgotten gods, cross mist-covered shores, and listen to the wisdom carried through time, softly, gently, without urgency. There is nothing you need to learn, nothing you need to follow. Only listen. Let your thoughts grow still, let your breathing slow, and allow the story to carry you between waking and sleep. Now. The fire burns low, the night deepens, and the story begins. There are places in Ireland where the land seems to remember something the people no longer say aloud. You may walk for a long while through the open country and think at first that all before you is only field and pasture, stone and grass, the long patient work of hands that have turned the soil through many lifetimes. There are low walls of grey stone laid one upon another without mortar, each rock weathered by rain and winter, and the salt breath that wanders inland from the sea. Narrow roads bend softly between hedges, and the hedges themselves are old, woven thick with thorn and briar, with ash and blackthorn, and in their hidden places small birds stir and settle as the day leans on. The fields spread wide under the sky, some green with a soft richness, some pale where cattle have cropped them close, some shining faintly with wet where the morning dew lingers longer than expected in the hollows. Here and there lie rushy corners where the ground keeps the memory of water. There are gates with rust dark upon the iron, and narrow boreens wandering away between banks of ferns, turning and turning until they are lost beyond a rise of land or a stand of trees. In the distance, cattle move with the slow and thoughtful grace of creatures who have no quarrel with time. A dog barks once from some unseen farmyard, and then the sound is taken into the stillness. It is a quiet country, though not an empty one. The quiet in such places is never bare. It is full of small things. The ticking call of a robin from a hawthorn bush. The hush of wind brushing through long grass by a ditch. The sound of water slipping beneath a little stone bridge and moving on beneath nettles and willow roots. At evening there are swallows folding and turning in the lowering light. At dawn there is the low silver of mist lying in the fields, and beyond it the first clear songs of birds rising as though out of the earth itself. And scattered among these fields, older than many of the farms, older than the boundaries men drew for sheep and cattle, older than the roads that now curve around them as water parts around stone, there are the quiet circles. You do not always notice them at once. Sometimes they lie on a slight rise, a roundness in the land that the eye catches only after a time, as if the earth had drawn a breath there and held it. Sometimes they're ringed in green more vivid than the pasture beyond, their grass thick and soft, as untouched by plough or hoof. Sometimes a single bush or thorn tree stands within them, bent a little by the years, yet still holding its place. And sometimes the circle is only a low swelling, scarcely more than a memory of a ring, but even then it does not seem like the rest of the ground. It has a stillness of its own. The country paths know them. The old roads do not run through them, though many things in this world have been cut through, or levelled, or broken in the name of need. A lane may bend unexpectedly. A wall may end and begin again farther on. A gate may open toward a meadow, and yet leave one rounded place untouched, standing in the midst of grass, as a silence stands in the midst of speech. Those who live long with the land do not always speak of such things, but their hands remember, their feet remember, and the wheel remembers where not to turn. I have seen these circles at noon beneath a broad, bright sky when every blade of grass was plain to the eye, and they seemed no less mysterious for being fully lit. I have seen them in the long amber hour before sunset, when the shadows of the hedges reach thin and delicate across the fields, and the crows go home black against the west. I have seen them after rain, when the whole countryside shone dark and fresh, and the stones smelled of water, and the rings rose out of the earth with a deeper green about them, as if something below had listened closely to the falling drops. I have seen them in winter too, when the fields lay bare and the trees had given up their leaves, and the circles seemed even older then, with the year stripped back and the bones of the land more clearly shown. No two are ever entirely alike. One may lie near a little stream where yellow flag iris grows in the softer months, and where the banks are trodden by cattle coming to drink. Another may rest high on stony ground, looking far across many fields toward a distant ridge. One may be wrapped in gorse and bramble, half hidden, as if the land had drawn a green cloak about its shoulders. Another may stand plain and open in the middle of pasture, ring upon ring of earth faintly lifting beneath the grass. Yet each of them bears the same hush, the same withdrawn and patient air, as if they belonged not only to the place where they stand, but to a deeper country, beneath the visible one, and the people have always lived beside them. Children have run the lanes in summer, carrying sticks or driving geese, and glanced toward the round green places without going near. Women have crossed fields under baskets of turf or linen, their skirts brushing the meadow flowers. Men have mended walls, dug drains, cut hay, milked cows in the first pale light. The years have turned over them like weather. The voices have changed. Houses have fallen and been rebuilt. Roofs have gone from thatch to slate and from slate to tin. Yet still the circles remained where they were, as though they had been set there before the naming of the farms, and had no mind to move for any generation of humankind. There are fields where the grass grows differently around them. There are places where sheep drift wide without being driven. There are corners where the blackberries ripen thick along the hedge, yet no one stoops to gather the fruit nearest the ring. In some places the stones of an old wall have slumped and softened back into the earth, but the circle within the field still keeps its curve with a kind of quiet authority, and when evening comes over the countryside, a different feeling gathers there. The smoke rises from scattered chimneys and lies blue for a time in the cooling air. Cows stand dark and mild against the last of the light. The west opens in bands of gold and pearl, and the clouds drift slowly over distant hills. Along the lanes the nettles darken, and the briars hold the last pale glimmer. Somewhere a gate clicks shut. Somewhere a stream goes on talking to itself in the roots of alder trees. Then those old circles seem to withdraw even further into themselves. Not vanishing, no, but deepening, becoming less like marks upon the land and more like thoughts held by it. Either they stand in the quiet fields as they have always stood, while the generations pass like shadows over water, and looking upon them, one feels not fear nor even wonder at first, but something gentler and older than either. A sense that the earth here is keeping company with memory. A sense that beneath the grasses, beneath the roots of thorn and dock and meadow sweet, something ancient lies listening still. So the countryside goes on in its ordinary grace. The stone walls, the winding paths, the wet shine of morning, the long fields beneath the moving sky. Yet among all these familiar things remain the forgotten circles, hushed and patient, carrying within their green boundaries an age the roads do not name and the farms do not measure. They are there when the swallows return. They are there when frost whitens the gates. They are there when lambs cry in the spring fields, and when autumn crows settle on the bare branches, and all the while the land in its old slow manner remembers them. In the elder telling of the countryside, those quiet circles were not always so hushed and grass-bound as they seem now beneath the open sky. There was a time when hearth smoke rose from within them, when the ring of earth held not only silence, but the warmth of living hands, the tread of bare feet upon trodden ground, and the low familiar sounds of a household gathered close against the turning of the year. For the land was peopled early and gently in those places. Where now the banks lie softened under meadow grass, there were once earthen walls newly raised, rounded strong around a dwelling place. The earth was cut and lifted with care, laid up in a broad ring that marked out a home from the wide fields beyond. Inside that sheltering circle stood timber houses with roofs of thatch or reed, their walls smelling of wood, smoke, and rain. The posts were sunk firm into the ground, the doorways open toward the light. In the mornings, the first stirring of the day came with the lifting of a latch, the crackle of embers coaxed back to flame, and the pale wash of dawn finding its way across the threshold. Within those rings there was a life both simple and full. A family might dwell there through many seasons, close to the cattle they valued, and the land they knew by every hollow and rise. Beside the house there could be small enclosures of wattled wood, where calves were kept from wandering, or where a few pigs rooted softly in the straw. Chickens scratched among the scraps and chaff. A hound slept near the doorway, until some sound in the lane or field caused one ear to lift. Near the house a little store hut might stand upon short posts, or were holding grain dry above the reach of damp and vermin. There were vessels of wood and clay, woven baskets, iron hung over the fire, and tools that bore the shine of long use from hand and weather both. Outside the ring fort the fields carried the quiet labour of the year. Strips of land were turned and sown. Barley bowed in the wind when summer came well. Oats silvered beneath a passing cloud. Cows were led out at first light and brought back at dusk, their flanks dark in rain, their breath white in the colder months. Sheep moved in pale knots across the rougher ground. In wet places near a stream the grass grew lush and sweet. Along the edges of the tilled soil flowers still had their place, and bees went about their old golden work among foxglove and clover, meadowsweet and stitchwort. The ringfoot sat within all this as the heart sits within the breast, held and holding. It was not a grand life, nor a loud one, but it was deeply woven into the land. The children who grew there knew the way light changed over the fields before rain. They knew where blackberries ripened thickest in the hedge, and where watercress could be found by the shallower runs of the stream. They knew the bark of ash and hazel, the softness of moss upon a north stone, the smell of cows in the byre, the feel of warm bread torn by hand near the fire. In the evenings, when the day's work had settled and the cattle were safe within their bounds, voices would lower into the old cadence of telling. A tale might be spoken while the embers glowed. A song might move quietly beneath the rafters. The firelight would touch the timber walls and the faces gathered near, while beyond the earthen ring the night spread wide over field and road and hill. The ring itself gave a kind of comfort. Whether against wind, wandering beast, or the unease that often travels with darkness, there is solace in a boundary shaped by care. The earthen bank rose around the home like an embrace of soil and effort. It said, "Here is a place kept." It said, "Here is a hearth, a flock, a memory being made." And though the sky remained vast above, and the land beyond could never truly be shut out, still there was peace in that curved enclosure, where the living gathered close, and the year was measured in lambing, sowing, cutting, harvest, and the return again to winter fire. Yet no dwelling of wood and thatch stands forever. The years moved as they always do, quietly and without haste. One family passed, another remained for a time, and perhaps after them another still. Then the day came when the fire was not lit again. Perhaps the people followed kin to another valley. Perhaps the ground had grown less kind. Perhaps some sorrow or change, long forgotten now by name, turned their steps elsewhere. The cattle were driven out through the gap in the bank. The door-beam fell silent. The yard that had known laughter and work lay still beneath the weather. At first the traces remained plain. The timber walls stood a while longer, silvering with rain. The threshold kept its shape. Ashes rested cold in the hearth. Grass began to push up where feet no longer passed daily. Nettles gathered near the places where scraps had once been cast. The path from the doorway to the enclosure blurred at the edges. A season went by, then another, and the air and rain took what had been left behind into their keeping. Slowly the land began its patient reclaiming. The roof thatch loosened and sank. Beams softened with damp and gave way. Moss found the shadier timbers first, then spread over what remained. Wind brought seed. A tuft of grass took root in the bank. Wildflowers returned in small, bright clusters. Bramble reached outward. Ferns opened where once there had been swept ground. The earthen ring endured longest, for earth returns kindly to itself, and though the hand that shaped it was gone, the curve held on beneath the greening cover. Nearby, trees began to gather. A hawthorn might rise at the edge of the old enclosure, white with blossom in one season, and red with berries in the next. An ash might root itself where a corner of fencing had rotted back into soil. Hazel thickened along the outer bank. Ivy crept among the remains of timber. Birds nested where once smoke had drifted. In damp weather the place smelled of leaf mould, wet bark, and the sweetness of grass after rain. The ring fort, no longer a hearth place, became again a part of the breathing countryside. Yet it never quite became the same as the field around it. Even after long years when the house had vanished and the enclosure posts were only dark memory beneath the grass, the shape remained. The bank kept its roundness. The ditch, though softened, still carried shadow when the light fell low. The cattle grazed near it but marked it with their circling path. The plough, where there was ploughing, turned aside, and those who passed by on the old roads could see, without needing to say much of it, that this was once a dwelling place, a ring where people had lived close to one another and close to the land. So the old ring forts settled into their second life. No longer homes, yet not empty either. They held the after sense of shelter. They kept, in their green silence, the memory of hands that built, of voices that rose and faded, of winter fires and summer mornings, of animals breathing softly in the pen, of children growing beneath the turn of the seasons. Grass covered the banks, trees leaned near. The years drifted over them like cloud shadow over pasture, and the land, taking them back without haste or cruelty, wrapped them in moss, root, bird song and weather, until they seemed once more to belong wholly to the earth. But still, for all that quiet greening, something of the old keeping remained within them. Something of the circle as shelter, something of the ring as a place apart. And so they endured in the fields, half remembered by the soil itself, while the countryside moved on around them in its old unhurried way. In the slow turning of the years, the ring forts became silent places. The people who had once lived within them moved onward, as people do, following the call of kin or the quiet unfolding of their own lives. And in their absence the air around the circles grew stiller, though not empty. The fields continued their work, the seasons kept their turning, and the wind, that ancient traveller, still whispered across the hills. But the circles, where once the tread of feet had gone soft in the earth, stood quiet. Farmers who worked their land found their ploughs grazing around the earthworks. The great iron tips of the plough would often halt at the lip of the ring, and the farmer, without question, would guide the horse to turn aside, letting the earthwork rest untouched beneath the open sky. The same might happen when the harrow came, or the sickle in harvest. A boundary had settled in the mind, invisible but firm, and no hand ever quite dared to disturb the curve of the earth. It was not that the farmers were afraid in any overt way, but something more subtle hung in the air around those quiet places. It was as if the circles themselves had called for distance, asking only to be left alone, to remain as they were, silent and undisturbed, for the land itself seemed to know they had a place of their own, one that could not be taken or moved. Where once the roads had wound up to the doors of the dwellings within the rings, now they curved gently away, as if the ground itself remembered how the circles had always belonged to a time long past. The paths that had once cut through the fields to the homes now softened and wandered, as though they, too, knew that the houses were no longer to be found there. Cattle, too, seemed to pass them by with a kind of care, and though they might graze nearby, they would avoid the circle, as if the earth had marked it with a quiet warning, one that lived deeper than any fence or wall could bear. And so it was that these places fell silent, one after another. The grass grew tall within their banks, the hawthorn trees took deeper root in their centres, and wildflowers. Purple clover, yellow buttercups, delicate white stitchwort blanketed the earth beneath the low moss-covered walls. Time, like a gentle wind, blew through the fields, and still the rings remained, still and watchful, holding their silence as only places that have witnessed so much time can. In spring, when the air grew soft and full of the scent of earth and blossom, and the sound of bees filled the air, there would be those who walked by, their eyes drifting briefly over the quiet mounds. Their steps would pass in the direction of the next field or the next gate, but the circle would be there, still beneath their gaze, a silent witness to the quiet rhythm of the land, its old watchful shape holding the space of an older memory. The wind would rustle the leaves of the trees that stood nearby, and the air would carry the soft hum of distant bird calls, but it was as if the ring fort itself held its breath, watching, without asking for anything more. There were few now who spoke of the circles, for the land had settled them into their own kind of peace, and the people had gone on, weaving their lives into the fabric of the fields and the hills as they always had. Yet still, every so often, in the corners of memory there lingered a quiet sense that something had once lived here. Something had once made these places their own. There was no fear of them, no superstition that clung to the air. It was simply that they were left undisturbed, marked as places apart by the very land itself. Perhaps there was an old tale still whispered by a grandmother to a child, or a brief telling when a young lad, walking with his dog on a quiet afternoon, passed near the edge of one of these rings, a reminder perhaps that these were once places of life, where people lived close to the earth. But the whispers were faint now, fading like the evening mist, leaving only the sense of memory and the watchful stillness that hung over the land. The land, in its own way, began to take back the ring forts. It was not harsh or sudden. There was no claim to be made, no fierce reclaiming. The earth simply drew its long, slow breath, sending roots into the earthworks, wrapping around the stones and the wood, softening the edges of the banks with moss, fern, and creeping ivy. The trees that grew beside the circles, hawthorn, elder, ash, spoke little, but grew tall, their branches twisting skyward, their roots finding a quiet place in the softness of the earth. The stones that once marked the boundaries of the dwellings, now half embedded in the earth, seemed to settle into their quiet role, standing as watchful sentinels, though no longer with the same need for shelter. By evening, when the sun dropped low behind the hills, the shadows stretched long across the land, and there was something profoundly still about the sight of these earthworks in the fading light. It was not a stillness of emptiness, but a deep, soft kind of waiting. A waiting that spoke of memory and time, of things long past but never fully gone. The twilight air seemed to hold the quiet echoes of old voices, of laughter and labour, of soft footsteps that had once moved within those very rings, of children playing in the dappled shade of the hawthorn trees, of hands weaving baskets, of pots bubbling over the fire. And as the darkness deepened, the rings held their place under the starry sky, still and watchful, marking the land in their old quiet way. They had become more than mere circles of earth. They had become something else, part of the landscape, part of the memory of the land itself, holding a kind of ancient patience. The people who passed them now did not need to speak their names. They simply acknowledged the circles in their quiet, unnoticed way, passing on their journeys, while the earth and the sky held the old places in silence, waiting. The land had made its peace with the circles, and though the people had moved on, there was something in the soil, in the trees, and in the stones that could never fully forget. They had not been left behind. No, the circles had been quietly folded back into the great slow memory of the land, and they would remain there beneath the soft breath of the earth, watching, waiting, and keeping their silent vigil. There came, in time, another kind of silence around those old rings. Not the silence of abandonment alone, nor only the hush that gathers where grass has covered the footprints of the living, but a silence that seemed to listen back. It was then that the people of the countryside began to speak of the circles differently. Not often, not loudly. The old ways of speaking seldom rose above the tone of hearth-fire conversation or the low exchange between one neighbour and another at a gate. Yet the thought passed from house to house, from grandmother to child, from father to son walking the boundary of a field at dusk, that the old ringed places were not empty after all. The people had watched them too long to believe they were merely hollows in the grass. There were fields that changed year by year, and walls that had to be mended after every hard winter, and roofs that needed new thatch, and drains that filled with reeds if left untended. But the old circles remained somehow apart from such ordinary wearing. They settled deeper into the land and yet did not disappear. The grass upon them often seemed thicker. The hawthorn near them stood with a kind of lonely dignity. The cattle gave them space when there was no gate to command it. The lane bent away. The hand drawing a map of boundaries in the mind of the farm would leave a little round silence at the centre of things. So it came to be said that those places belonged to the she. Not with argument, not with explanation. It was simply known in the way the weather is known by the smell of the morning air, or the season by the leaning of light over the hills. Beneath the old rings, beneath the rounded banks and the roots of grass and thorn, there were said to be halls not seen by human eyes in the common brightness of day. Fine halls deep within the earth, where the fair folk kept their own company beyond the notice of plough and spade. And what looked from above like an old earthwork, softened by rain and time, was to those below no ruin at all, but a doorway hidden under the green skin of the land. The saying changed the way people looked at those places. A ring fort was no longer only an old dwelling of forgotten families. It was a fairy fort, a place held by older presences, a place occupied by those who didn't live as humankind lives, nor measure their days by market, harvest, or bell. The countryside had always known depth beneath its surface. It was but now that depth took on a name carried carefully on the tongue. She. A word half like a breath and half like a hill shadow, soft to say, and softer still to leave unspoken when passing a thorn tree alone in the evening. The warnings, too, were gentle in their way. No one made a grand speech of them. A child might be told when wandering too near a ring fort with a stick in hand, "Leave that place be." A young man cutting furs for the fire would hear from his mother, "Not from there now, not from the fort." A farmer planning to widen a lane or pull a stone from the field would be advised by an older neighbour to turn his effort elsewhere. Best not trouble that ground. Such words were offered the way one offers caution near deep water or a steep cliff path, quietly, with no need for much more. And because the countryside is a place where memory walks beside daily labour, the warning held. No one dug into the old rings for convenience. No one carried away the hawthorn if it stood there, though many another tree might be cut for timber or winter fuel. If a gap in a wall could be repaired with stones lying closer to hand, then those stones were taken instead. If the plough met the curve of an ancient bank, it turned away as it always had. What the people left untouched was as much a part of the old custom as what they planted, reaped, or built. I have known roads where a single fairy fort stood near enough to a good straight route that any practical mind might have cut through it and spared effort for cart and beast. Yet the road wandered around. I've seen fields where every furrow ran neat and measured, except for one round green space left whole in the centre like an eye left open. I have passed through orchard land where the apple trees stood in ordered lines, but one hawthorn rose undisturbed beyond them beside an old earthen ring, and no one spoke of removing it. The land was worked, yes, and closely, but some places were left in the keeping of other hands. There were those who said the fair folk did not love noise, nor iron biting deep into their ground, nor the careless hand that broke branch or bank only because it could. There were those who said the she had long memories, and that insult given to their places was never entirely forgotten. Yet even these things were rarely spoken in a hard voice. They came instead as part of the countryside's own teaching, the same teaching that tells when to sow ahead of rain, when to leave the river path in flood, when to show courtesy to the old and gentleness to animals. Respect was not a burden then. It was simply a way of remaining in good relation with what could not be fully seen, and so the names settled over the land. Fairy Fort, Fairy Ring, Fairy Hill. Each name laid a different light upon the old circles, yet all carried the same quiet recognition, that beneath the ordinary field and beneath the roots of grass there remained another nearness. Not close in the way a house stands close to a road, but close in the way music is close to silence, waiting within it. The people might not see the she, but they felt their claim in the careful turning aside of wheel and plough, in the untouched thorn, in the hush that gathered when evening drew long blue shadows across the pasture. At dusk especially, the belief seemed to breathe more clearly through the countryside. Smoke rose from cottages in thin pale threads. Rooks crossed homeward over the darkening fields. The hedges lost their sharper shape and became soft lines beneath the fading gold of the west. In that hour the old rings did not stand out less, but more. Their roundness gathered the dim light into itself. A hawthorn near one might hold the last whiteness of blossom, or the last gleam of berries like small embers in the branches. The field around would fall to shadow, while the fairy fort seemed to wait in a stillness so complete that one might imagine it listening for footfall not meant for human ears. It was enough to make people lower their voices when passing by. Not in terror, not in dread. Only with the instinct one brings to a chapel left open in the evening, say an awe to a holy well under old trees, or to any place where the world feels thinner and older than the day's concerns. There are kinds of reverence that never ask to be named. They live in the gesture, in the path avoided, in the stone not lifted, in the branch not cut. Thus the old circles changed again in the mind of the land. Once they had held families, cattle, smoke, and shelter. Then they had fallen silent beneath moss and weather. And now, in the long memory of the countryside, they had become the dwellings of the fair folk, the hidden places of the she, held in quiet regard by those who lived beside them. No hand disturbed the old rings, no voice mocked them carelessly. They remained where they had always been, green and watchful under the wheeling sky, while the people passed on their roads and carried the warning onward, gentle as twilight from one generation to the next. There is a kind of tree the countryside does not forget. You may see it standing alone in the middle of a field where no other tree has been spared, its shape small against the breadth of the pasture, its branches twisted by wind and season, its trunk grey and rough as old bone beneath the bark. In spring it carries a brightness all its own, for the blossoms come pale and plentiful, white as milk foam or the early light upon still water. In autumn the red berries shine among the thorns like tiny drops of fire held in the hand of the year. And often, if you follow the old roads and the narrow lanes long enough, you will find such a tree near one of the ancient rings, standing close beside the earthen curve, as though it had grown there not by chance but by an older belonging. A lone hawthorn by a fairy fort is never merely a tree. The fields around it may be busy with the life of ordinary days. Cattle may graze with their slow, mild eyes turned toward the ground. Sheep may move across the slope like pale clouds fallen gently to earth. The walls may need mending. The gates may sag upon their hinges. In the farther meadow a man may be turning hay under a broad noon sky, or leading a horse along the edge of a damp green lane. Yet there, beside the old ring fort, the hawthorn stands untouched, and the space around it seems to keep a hush that does not belong to labour. The people always knew the tree. They knew its blossoms in the softening year, when the hedges began to stir with life again, and the birds nested deep among the thorn. They knew the scent of it too, that strange sweet fragrance moving on the air when evening light lingered long above the fields. They knew its berries in the cooling months, when the mornings silvered with dew and the leaves began to turn and loosen, and they knew, above all, that there were some hawthorns no hand should cut. Many a tree in the countryside gave itself to use. Ash might be taken for tool handles, hazel for rods and woven fencing, alder from the water's edge for firewood when the winter nights deepened. Willow could be trimmed back and would come again. Even the elder, with all its old associations, might be pruned where it leaned too close to a dwelling. The land has always asked much of those who live upon it, and in answer they have gathered timber, thorn, rush, turf, and stone with careful hands. But the hawthorn beside the fairy fort was left where it stood. A farmer might clear a boundary line and spare only that one tree. He might cut back briar, elder, and young ash where they crowded the ditch, yet leave the hawthorn rising in its own quiet shape beside the old earth bank. Another might fell a storm-damaged tree near the road, and split it before nightfall for fuel, but he would not set his blade to the lonely thorn at the fort. Even when fields were remade and stone walls shifted, and even when the practical mind could have found good reason to remove it, still the hawthorn remained. It stood in rain and moonlight, in blossom and in berry, watched over by the same silence that rested on the ring fort itself. For it was said the Sidhe favoured such trees. Not every thorn tree, perhaps, though each had its own old dignity, but certain ones especially, those standing near the ancient circles or upon a little rise in a field, or beside a path that seemed older than the road drawn on any map. These were held to belong to the hidden folk, the fair people beneath the hills, whose dwellings lay under green mounds and earthen rings where the land dipped softly into another kind of depth. The hawthorn was thought to mark their nearness, to stand as a sign of their passage, or perhaps as a sentinel above some doorway the human eye could not fully see. And so respect gathered around the tree as mist gathers above a stream at dawn. It did not need to be declared. A child sent to fetch cattle or open a gate would hear from an elder, "Mind that thorn now." A young woman crossing the field at twilight would not pluck a branch from it, though she might gather flowers elsewhere along the hedge. A man passing late with a lantern in the lambing season would give it a wide step, not from fear alone, but from courtesy, as one passes gently before a house where others sleep. The tree stood in its own keeping. I've seen such a hawthorn in the late evening when the sky beyond the fields was all pearl and amber, and the ring fort lay dark beneath the long grass, and the tree itself held the last brightness of the day among its blossoms. The cattle had gone farther off. The lane was empty. There was only the sound of a stream moving quietly under reeds and the soft calling of birds settling for the night. In that hour the thorn seemed almost to listen, its branches still, its roots deep in the old earth beside the ring. One could imagine, without strain, that the land beneath it was not closed but waiting. I've seen another on a day of soft rain. The field was silvered through with wet, and the ditch water moved brown and gentle between its mossy stones. The bank of the fairy fort rose green, and rounded under the rain, and the hawthorn leaned a little into the weather, every thorn darkened, every leaf shining. There was no voice in the field but the rain itself, and yet the place felt far from empty. Rather it seemed accompanied, as if something quiet and old kept company there beneath the falling water. Such places do not ask belief in the hard way of argument. They ask only that one stand still long enough to feel how deeply the silence is inhabited. The old people, when they spoke of these trees, seldom embroidered the matter. They didn't need to. The countryside itself had long since made the lesson plain. The untouched thorn in the middle of a worked field said more than any sermon. The road bending around it, the plough turned aside, the branch left unbroken, the blossom unpicked. These were the speech of custom, and custom in such places often carries older knowledge than words can hold. It is one thing to hear that a hawthorn belongs to the she, it is another to see that generation after generation has lived as though it does. And there is something about the tree itself that invites such thoughts. Its shape is seldom grand, yet never without character. It grows in a way that seems half patient and half secretive, twisting into itself while opening outward to light and weather. In winter its bare branches trace dark patterns against the pale sky, intricate as old handwriting. In spring it clothes itself suddenly in white, as though some hidden hand had lit small stars along every bough. In summer it stands deep in leaf, casting a thin and broken shade upon the grass. In autumn the berries gleam red among the thorns, while the fort beside it lies quiet under drifting leaves. Through all seasons it appears at once humble and set apart. Perhaps that is why the respect remained so steady. The fairy fort held the memory of those who had lived and gone, and the deeper whisper of those said never to have left. The hawthorn beside it seemed to root that whisper into the visible world. It gave the unseen a shape one could pass each day and still not fully explain. A man might know every furrow of his field, every stone of his boundary wall, every beast in his keeping, and yet still look at that lone thorn beside the old ring and feel there was something near at hand that belonged to another order of the land. So the tree remained, blossoming when the swallows returned, bearing berries when the evenings drew in, standing through frost, rain, starlight, and slow dawns. And the people, for all their labour and all the changes that moved across the countryside, continued to leave it in peace. The hawthorn by the fairy fort was not theirs to claim. It belonged, as the old saying went, to the good people beneath the hill, to the silent company of the she, to the deep courteous mystery the land had never ceased to remember. Thus in the wide and ordinary fields, amid cattle paths, stone walls, and weathered gates, the lone thorn stood like a small sacred thing, quietly holding open the thought that the old rings were never truly empty, and that beside them the hidden realm still breathed close beneath the grass. There are laws that are spoken aloud in the hearing of many, and there are laws the countryside keeps in a quieter way. The old customs around the fairy forts were like that. They were not written upon parchment, nor nailed to church doors, nor carried from town to town by any officer's voice. No judge sat beneath a roof beam to proclaim them. No clerk bent over ink to record them. Yet they lived as firmly as stone in the mind of the land and in the habits of those who worked it. They passed from one generation into the next with the ease of weather passing over a field, almost unnoticed, and yet never failing to leave its mark. One did not remove stones from a fairy fort. That was known. If a man walking his field saw good stones lying half hidden near an old earthen ring, stones that might have served well enough in mending a broken boundary wall or shoring the side of a gateway, he let them lie. Other stones could be found. The ditch near the lane might yield some. The lower pasture, where frost had lifted them through the years, might offer more. A wall could be repaired by patience and a few extra journeys with the cart. But the stones of the old fort, even where they seemed loose and useful, remained in their quiet place. For stones remember more than people think. They keep the warmth of the sun and the wetness of rain. They gather lichen, moss, and shadow. They settle deeply into the ground and take on the stillness of whatever has long surrounded them. A stone from the fairy fort was not like a stone from the roadside or from a field newly turned. It had lain too long within that round-keeping. It belonged to the shape of the place, to the old ring, and the hush held within it. To carry it away was not merely to move a thing from one place to another. It was to disturb a pattern older than one's own needs. And so the stone remained. A gate might hang crooked another few days. A wall might wait until Saturday or until after Mass. a farmer, practical in all other matters, would shoulder the extra labour and say nothing more of it. The old fort was left whole, even in its ruin, even in its partial sinking back into the earth. That too was part of the keeping. Nor did one cut the hawthorn tree. The hawthorn, standing alone beside the fort or rising out of the ring itself, was left with a respect so steady that it scarcely needed mention. Men who trimmed hedges, coppiced hazel, cut ash poles, and split alder for the hearth would pass by the fairy thorn without lifting a blade against it. If branches from other trees were gathered after a storm, that tree was left to its own weather. If the ditch beside it filled thick with briar and elder, those might be cut back, but not the thorn. Even when its trunk leaned or its shadow fell in a way that made ploughing awkward, still it was spared. The custom lived not in fear alone, though fear had its place in some tellings, but in something older and gentler: courtesy. A hawthorn at a fairy fort was part of the dwelling of the unseen. One did not take from it any more than one would enter another's house unbidden, and begin removing what pleased the eye. To cut it was to forget where one stood. The practical farmer, whose hands understood timber and weight and the value of every useful thing, understood this too. There are places where usefulness must bow to belonging, and no one dug into the ring of earth. This perhaps was the quietest rule of all, yet also the strongest. The banks of the old forts were not broken for fill. Their ditches were not deepened for drainage. Their circles were not flattened merely because a larger field would be easier to work. The earth rose and fell in its ancient curve, and the plough turned aside. A new furrow could begin a little farther off. A cart could take another route. A fence could bend. Labour might be added by such choices, but the old ring remained untouched. What is strange to those who know only the harder mind of use is how naturally the people accepted this. The countryside was full of practical souls. Men and women rose early, worked in cold rain, counted fodder, measured seed, watched the sky, and knew well the cost of wasted effort. They did not live by dream alone. Their boots were muddy. Their backs were bent with labour. They understood hunger, storm, broken tools, and the small arithmetic of surviving one season to reach the next. Yet even such people honoured the old warnings. In this there was no contradiction. They knew that a life close to the land requires more than effort. It requires right relation. And right relation includes knowing what not to touch. So the customs endured. A grandfather might not give a long explanation to the boy walking beside him with a stick over his shoulder. He might simply say, "Leave those stones where they are." The boy would hear the tone and remember. A mother passing through a field in the late light might tell her daughter, "Do not break a branch from that thorn." No more would be needed. A man planning a drain through wet ground might be advised by an older neighbour, "Take it round the fort." There was wisdom in such brief sayings, not because they answered every question, but because they placed the question within an older order. And the order was felt everywhere around the fairy forts. In summer, when the grass stood high and insects hummed in the warm air, the ring of earth kept its stillness while the worked field moved with ordinary life. In autumn, when the cattle were brought in earlier, and the evenings leaned quickly toward dark, the old fort lay beneath drifting leaves and ripening berries, untouched as ever. In winter, when frost hardened the tracks by the gate and every practical thought turned toward fuel and shelter, still the hawthorn was not cut, still the stones were not taken, still the bank was not broken. Even necessity, that stern companion of country life, seemed to lower its voice when passing those old places, perhaps because the people sensed that the forts belonged to time in a different way. A fence post rots and is replaced. A roof loosens and is repaired. A path grows muddy and is mended with gravel. Such things belong to the daily pact between hand and land. But the fairy fort stood in another current, not outside the world, only deeper within it. The ordinary rules of improvement did not quite apply there. What one improved elsewhere, one preserved there. What one altered in the rest of the field, one left unchanged in the circle. The custom held the boundary. There were stories, of course, murmured by firesides when the wind was at the door, of those who had ignored such warnings and found no blessing afterward. A cow gone lame, a roof beam cracked, a sickness lingering strangely, a road project troubled by mishap. Yet the countryside did not need such tales every day to keep the customs alive. It was enough that the forts had long been treated with care. Habit itself became a kind of reverence. The generations, seeing what was spared, learned to spare it too. And so the old taboos lived on, not harshly but steadily. Never remove the stones, never cut the hawthorn, never dig into the ring. Simple words, though often left unspoken. They pass through memory like a quiet thread sewn into the life of the land. The farmer carrying a spade, the woman leading a child by the hand, the herd boy opening a gate at dusk, all moved within that inherited courtesy. The customs asked little in speech, yet much in respect, and because they were kept, the fairy forts remained as they had long remained, green and rounded beneath the sky, guarded not by walls or written laws, but by the faithfulness of ordinary people who knew that some places are best honoured by being left in peace. In the countryside, warnings were seldom carried by shouting. They came instead as small stories spoken near the hearth when rain tapped softly at the window, or along a lane at evening when the cattle had been brought in and the sky still held a little dim gold behind the hedges. A tale might be told while hands were busy with mending or peeling, while turf settled in the grate and the room grew warm with firelight and the smell of wool and smoke. No one needed to raise a fearful voice. The story itself, if remembered long enough, carried its own quiet weight. So it was with the tales told of those who did not heed the old customs of the fairy forts. Not every tale was repeated everywhere, for the land keeps its stories as streams keep pools and bends, each place holding its own reflection. But the heart of them was often the same. Someone, thinking more of present need than old respect, would take what ought to have been left undisturbed, a stone, a branch, a sod of earth from the ring itself, and afterwards something in the ordinary order of life would lean gently askew, as though the land had noticed the discourtesy and answered in its own unhurried way. There was an old tale told in one parish of a farmer who found, near the edge of a fairy fort, 2 broad stones fit for the mending of a gate-post. The winter had been hard on the gate. Rain had loosened the ground and the hinge sagged crookedly, so that each opening and closing was a trouble. The man had meant to repair it for weeks, but there was always something nearer at hand demanding time. At last, passing by the old ring on a cold bright morning, he looked down and saw the stones lying half clear in the grass, square enough, solid enough, and nearer than the quarry lane. He stood a while, so the story says, knowing well where he was. Yet practical thought came over him like a cloud over sunlight. Stone is stone, he said, or something close to it, and bent to lift them. He carried the stones home in the cart and set them well at the gate. The work was neatly done. The post stood firmer than before, and for that one afternoon he was pleased with himself. But from then on nothing at the gate seemed to go right. The hinge pin slipped twice in 1 week. The latch would not catch cleanly. One evening, though there was no great wind to speak of, the gate was found hanging open after dark with the cattle gone farther than they should have been. Another morning the post leaned again, though the ground had held well enough elsewhere. The farmer reset it, and still it shifted. He tightened the ironwork, and the bolt turned stubborn in his hand. No great calamity came. The house did not fall. The herd did not perish. It was only that the gate became a small and endless trouble, a thing forever asking to be mended and never keeping right. At last, an older neighbour, pausing by and hearing the complaints, looked long at the stonework and said, "You took those from the fort." The farmer answered little. Perhaps he denied it at first. Perhaps he only lowered his eyes. But before another week had passed, the stones were carried back and laid again where they had rested near the ring. New stones were fetched from farther off, and after that the gate stood easy. Such a tale was never told as though the land were eager to strike. It was told more like a reminder that things taken from certain places do not always settle happily elsewhere. A stone lifted from a fairy fort may hold too much of its first belonging. It may resist its second use. The misfortune in the story was not thunder or terror, but the wearying of daily life. The countryside has always known that not all consequences arrive with noise. Another tale spoke of a man who cut a hawthorn branch too near an old ring fort. It was not even the whole tree, only a heavy limb leaning low over the grass where his sheep liked to pass. The branch had thorns enough to catch wool and skin, and the man, thinking only of the flock and the smooth running of the field, brought a sharp blade one afternoon and lopped it clean. The white blossoms were out then, and they fell all around him in the grass like little drops of milk. He gathered the branch aside and thought no more of it. Yet that summer the sheep in that field would not settle easy. They broke from the corner nearest the fort for no clear reason. On calm evenings they grew restless, bunching and shifting, lifting their heads as though listening for something far off. One ewe that had always lambed well wandered before her time, and was found at dawn standing by the old thorn, staring into the ring with such still attention that the shepherd called her twice before she turned. Nothing dreadful came of it, but the season felt troubled. The flock never quite rested as before, and the man himself began to dislike the sight of the cut place on the tree where the pale wood showed through like a wound. When autumn came, he tied a strip of cloth to the thorn and left a little milk at the root, and from then on, so the telling went, the field grew quiet again. Whether the cloth and milk had any power of their own was not the point. The lesson lay in the gesture. One had taken without asking, and then one had remembered courtesy. The countryside, listening to such a story, would understand. There was also a softer tale of a boy, or in some tellings a young hired man, who dug into the outer bank of a fairy fort to fetch a little clay for patching a byre wall. He did not mean disrespect. He was only hurried, sent out at dusk with a spade, and the instruction to mend the crack before rain set in. The nearest good clay was there in the old ring, and he cut a few slices from the bank without much thought. The repair was made before nightfall, and no one spoke of it. But afterward, the byre would not keep dry. Water found its way in through the wall no matter how often it was patched. The straw stayed damp at one corner. A chill lingered where there should have been warmth. The cows shifted uneasily at that place, turning away from it as if from a draught that could not be felt by human skin. At last the eldest woman of the house, hearing where the clay had come from, told the young man to carry a new spadeful back and press it gently into the wounded bank. He did so before sunrise, while the dew was still thick on the grass, and in time the byre wall held better. Again, no great terror, only a crookedness in the ordinary order, a small refusal of things to go smoothly where an old courtesy had been broken. Yet that is how these stories move through the generations, not as cruel threats, but as lessons wrapped in memory. They taught that the world is not made only of what can be weighed in the hand or counted in the barn. There are places where use must yield to reverence, where the practical mind must bow a little before the older arrangements of the land. The fairy fort, the hawthorn, the untouched stones, all belong to that gentler law. And when such tales were told in the fading warmth of evening, with the last light dim on the window and the soft settling of ash in the grate, they did not leave the listener frightened. They left something quieter than fear, a sense of measure, a sense that respect is often the simplest wisdom, a sense that the hidden world, if hidden world there be, asks mostly to be left in peace. Then so the stories endured, mild as rain on a thatched roof, lingering as the scent of turf smoke in old wool, passing from one careful voice into another, while out beyond the door the fairy forts lay under the stars, silent and watchful in the fields. There are roads the eye can follow, and roads that only the old memory of the land can keep. The visible roads are easy enough to name. They wind between stone walls, dip at little bridges, climb slowly past fields of cattle and sheep, and turn toward white cottages where turf smoke rises blue in the stillness of evening. They are marked by wheels, by boots, by the weathering of the rain and frost. A man may point to them with his stick. A child may learn their bends by heart. They belong to the common world of crossing and return, of errands, market days, visiting, and the long familiar rhythm of feet moving from one place to another. But beneath and beyond those roads, the countryside has always been said to hold other ways. These are not laid in gravel or edged with ditch water. No grass is worn thin upon them by mortal tread. They cannot be seen in the broad honesty of noon, when every field lies open under the sun, and every gate and gable stands clear against the air. Yet people spoke of them all the same, quietly and without haste, as one speaks of a stream running underground through limestone country, hidden for a time and then rising again elsewhere under fern and moss. They were the paths of the Sidhe. It was said that the fairy forts did not stand alone, however distant they seemed from one another across the wide meadows and folded hills. One old ring on a rise above a stream, another in pasture beyond a dark line of ash trees, another near a lonely hawthorn by the bend of a lane, and another farther off where the land dropped toward the sea. To the ordinary eye they were only scattered places, each resting in its own silence. But the old belief held that between them ran unseen ways, straight as the flight of thought, linking fort to fort, hill to hill, tree to tree, as though the hidden folk passed beneath the same countryside by roads more ancient than the boreens, and more certain than the tracks left by cartwheels after rain. These paths were not imagined as wandering. Human roads curve for the sake of slope and stone, for marsh and stream, for boundary wall and stubborn hedge. They bend around what resists them. They bargain with the shape of the land. But the fairy paths were believed to keep a stranger faithfulness. They went as they wished, straight across meadow and rise, over old walls, through fields where sheep grazed or hay was cut, from one old place of power to another. If a fort stood westward of another, then the way between them was held to lie true in that direction, whether or not hedge, house, or lane stood in between. And because of that, people took care. It was not wise, they said, to build a house across such a path. This was one of those counsels the countryside carried in a quiet tone, never heavily argued, yet rarely dismissed. A cottage might be set a little to one side of the best sheltered place. A doorway might be chosen with unusual care. A byre wall might begin a few feet farther back than first intended. Those who planned a new dwelling, or even a small addition to an old one, would sometimes glance not only at drainage, wind, and the lay of the field, but at the lines between ancient places. Where did the old fort stand? What hawthorn marked the ridge beyond? What lonely ring lay in the next holding, and just visible when winter stripped the hedges bare? Such questions were not always spoken, but they moved softly in the background of thought. For something unseen was believed to travel those ways at night, not with the heavy tread of cattle returning, nor with the creak of cart wheels, nor the bark of dogs answering one another across the darkened fields. The Sidhe were thought to pass more lightly than that, in a motion too subtle for ordinary sound, though now and then a person awake late might feel a strangeness in the air, as if the night itself had turned its face. A stillness might gather in a place where the wind had been moving only a moment before. A horse in the stable might lift its head and listen. A sleeping child might stir, not in fear, but as leaves stir when something passes through branches too gently to be seen. And such tellings were offered softly, as if the story itself should not speak too loudly of what belongs to the dark hours. There were those who said that on certain nights the paths were more alive than on others, when the moon shone white upon the fields, and every stone wall cast a narrow black shadow, when the year stood at a turning, and the hedges seemed to hold their breath, when the dew was so bright on the grass before dawn that all the meadow looked silvered. In such times, the old people said, the hidden roads were not closed. They were open in their own manner, and the fair folk moved from fort to fort beneath the quiet face of the land. I remember hearing of one small house, built where no house should have stood. It was a tidy place by all accounts, whitewashed, neat in its thatch, with a little patch for cabbages and a gate that opened toward the lane. Yet from the first, nothing in it seemed entirely settled. The door would swing open on calm nights. Smoke, though the chimney was sound, would sometimes drift back into the room and hang there. The cow kept in the lean-to byre was restless after sunset, and had to be coaxed more than once to enter. The family slept, but not deeply. There was no great affliction, only a constant sense that the place was not wholly pleased to hold them. At last an older woman, visiting and standing quiet in the yard at twilight, looked toward the distant ring fort on one side, and the lone thorn on the rise beyond the bog on the other. "You're across a path," she said. Whether the house was later altered, or whether only the people's minds changed toward it, the tale never clearly says, but it was enough for those who heard it. A dwelling may be well built and yet poorly placed. The land has lines of its own, and not all of them are meant to be crossed by hearth and threshold. There are fields where even now a curious gap remains between structures, as though one thing had been set leftward and another rightward for no obvious reason. A man from elsewhere might call it poor planning, yet the old country eye sees another possibility. The space was left open, not wasted, left. Left because between the old fort under the hill and the thorn by the far boundary there ran perhaps an invisible passage. Left because some wisdom deeper than measurement advised, do not stand in that way. And what was it that travelled there? The countryside seldom answered too plainly. To speak too surely of such matters was never the custom. Some called them the good people. Some said the host of the She. Some simply lowered their voices and glanced toward the dark field beyond the window. It was enough to know that the paths were theirs, and that the night, for all its calm beauty, was not empty of movement merely because human eyes saw little. So the thought deepened in the land. The fairy forts were no longer only old circles, nor even only hidden dwellings beneath the earth. They were also stations upon a secret road, resting places in a network of passage no spade could uncover, and no map could fully mark. Across pasture, over stream, beside mossed wells and through orchard shadows, the unseen lines went on, binding ancient place to ancient place, while cottages slept and cattle breathed softly in their sheds. And because the people believed this, they made room. They built with care. They left openings where none seemed needed. They respected the silence between one old place and another. Thus the countryside held two geographies at once, the one of gates and lanes and measured fields, and the one of hidden pathways passing under moonlight from fort to fort, where the She were said to journey in the deep hours, when the ordinary world lay still and the ancient land remembered its other roads. There are old beliefs that do not sit upon the earth like ordinary thoughts, but seem instead to rise from beneath it, as water rises through a spring in limestone country, cool and clear from a depth no hand can follow. So it was with the belief in the halls of the She. The people of the countryside did not look upon the fairy forts merely as grassy circles left behind by time, nor only as places watched over by thorn trees and quiet customs. In the deeper hush of memory, those green rings were held to be thresholds. The bank of earth, rounded and low beneath the grazing sky, was only the outer sign. Beneath it, the old telling said, there opened a hidden world, vast and bright in its own secret manner, folded under the hills and fields of Ireland as a second country lies folded beneath the first. The earth was not thought empty below, it was thought full. Full of chambers no plough had ever broken, of passages running farther than any route, of halls opening one into another beneath the old forts and mounds, beneath the lonely hawthorns and the ridges where the land lifted softly against the weather. What seemed from above a mere rise in pasture might below be a doorway set within green silence. What looked like a simple ring of grass might be, in the old imagination, the crown of a dwelling more splendid than any house raised by timber and hand in the visible world. And these halls of the Sidhe were not dark in the way of buried things. That is one of the quiet marvels of the old remembering. Though they lay beneath the earth, they were imagined as places of soft radiance, filled with a light that didn't come from sun or flame and yet wanted for neither. A pale gold light, perhaps, like evening caught and held forever in a room of polished stone, or a silver brightness like moonlight upon still water, but gentler, deeper, and without chill. Some said the walls shone faintly as if lit from within by their own substance. Some imagined crystal hanging like frozen drops from vaulted ceilings. Others spoke of bronze and gold, of smooth pillars and wide floors that rang softly under light steps, though no hammer had ever shaped them, and no mortal quarry had yielded their stone. There was music there also, not loud music, nor the hurried music of fairs and dancing barns, but something finer and more enduring, as though the sound of harp strings, bird song, and moving water had been woven together into one unending sweetness. A person standing at twilight beside a fairy fort, hearing only the evening breeze in the grass and the last blackbird in the hedge, might still feel that beneath the bank another kind of listening was possible. That if the world grew quiet enough, if the cattle bells ceased and the stream lowered its voice, and the mind itself became still as a moonlit field, some far music might be sensed below, delicate as memory and old as the first telling ever shaped by human breath. And within those halls it was said the Sidhe gathered, not as weary folk gather after labour, nor as farmers gather for market or neighbours for a winter hearth, but in the changeless grace of their own timeless company. They sat in courts and circles beneath the earth, clothed in brightness, crowned perhaps with leaves or gold, their faces beautiful in the old sorrowful way of beings who do not live by the same measures as humankind. Their feast did not end, their cups did not empty, their songs moved on without fading. Youth remained among them as dew remains before the sun has risen, and no dust of age settled upon their garments or their hair. Time in that hidden country was not as it is here above. That too lay deep in the old thought. A night beside a fairy hill might contain more than one night should hold. A moment near the opening of such a place might stretch like a road through many seasons. The Sidhe were believed to live in a nearness to eternity, not beyond the world altogether, but folded beside it, under it, within it. Their halls were close as the roots of grass, and yet far as dream, and for that reason the fairy forts upon the land were treated with such care. For a threshold deserves greater courtesy than a wall, and a doorway greater gentleness than an empty ruin. I have walked in places where this belief seemed very near. A ring fort under evening light, the bank rounded with deep grass, a thorn tree leaning over one side with berries red against the fading blue of the sky, the lane empty, the cattle gone from the field, the first star appearing over a distant dark ridge. In such an hour the fairy fort no longer appears merely old. It begins to seem closed, as a door is closed, rather than forgotten. One feels not that the place has been abandoned, but that it is held from within. And then the mind, moving with the old stories, can almost imagine what lies below that quiet rise of earth. A descending brightness. a long passage smooth as flowing water, a chamber opening wide as a church nave, yet softer, more living, with walls that hold the gleam of amber and pearl, tables set with silver vessels, cloaks shimmering faintly like raven wings or autumn leaves after rain, voices low and musical, speaking in a language older than roadways and boundary stones, and through all of it a peace unlike common peace. For it is not the peace of stillness after labour, but the peace of a world complete in itself, hidden beneath our own. There were even those who held that the hills of Ireland were not hills alone, but the roofs of that other realm, the green swells in the land, the mounded ridges, the places where the earth seems to rise with unusual gentleness. All these could be thought of as coverings drawn over the hidden country of the Sidhe, and as beneath them ran their halls, their roads, their gathering places, their bright inward courts. What the eye saw above was field and pasture and stone wall and thorn. What the old imagination felt below was another kingdom, enclosed within the body of the land, invisible and enduring. This is why certain places draw the gaze without asking for it. A person may stand in a commonplace field and feel little more than the weather and the work still to be done. But beside a fairy fort there comes at times another sensation, one harder to name. The air seems slightly altered. The silence acquires depth. The ordinary field no longer feels wholly ordinary. It is as though the earth beneath one's feet were not merely supporting the day, but listening through it, holding under the grass a brightness and a company not gone, only concealed. And always there was the sense that the Sidhe were not dead, nor sleeping in the manner of stones. They were alive in their own hidden season, gathering beneath the forts, passing from hall to hall, listening to their music, keeping their feasts, moving through chambers of soft light, untouched by frost or rain, or the wearing of years. Above them the farmers sowed and cut and mended. Above them children crossed fields with bare knees wet from grass. Above them cows breathed in winter sheds and swallows returned in spring. The whole visible countryside went on in its patient turning. Yet below, if the old tellings are to be trusted, another life continued in parallel beauty, ancient and unwearied. So the fairy forts grew deeper in meaning. They were not only rings left by forgotten generations, not only places guarded by custom and hawthorn and warning. They became, in the imagination of the land, entrances, soft-covered thresholds, green-marked lids upon a hidden splendour. And the thought of them carried a peculiar sweetness, for it suggested that beneath the fields and roads and ordinary labours of the world, wonder had never departed. It had only gone inward, taking up its dwelling in the halls below the hills, where the Sidhe still gathered beyond the reach of time beneath the quiet earth of Ireland. There are certain nights in the turning of the year when the countryside seems to loosen its hold upon the ordinary world. Nothing dramatic announces them. The roads remain where they have always been. The fields lie under the same sky. The cattle graze. The streams move on beneath their grasses. The thorn trees keep their patient watch beside the old forts. Yet something in the air grows finer then, as though the distance between what is seen and what is only half remembered has become very slight, no thicker than a veil of rain drifting across a far hill. On such nights, the old people said, the hidden world draws near. They did not speak of it with noise or excitement. Such matters were not for loud telling. They were spoken of in the low and even tone reserved for weather signs, death notices, would annul truths that had no need of argument. A woman closing the shutters at dusk might glance toward the fairy fort in the lower field and murmur that it was a night to keep indoors. A man bringing in the last of the tools before dark might stand a little while by the gate listening before he turned the key. A grandmother, with firelight moving softly over her hands, might remind the younger ones not to wander late by the old ring on a night like this. for there were times in the year when the worlds were thought to stand closer together. At the turning into winter, when the leaves had thinned and the land lay open beneath an early dark, and the wind moved through bare branches with a hollow gentleness the old boundary was said to soften. At the first full greening of summer too. When the evening stretched long and the hawthorn stood white in blossom near the fairy forts, there were those who watched the fields with a quieter eye. And sometimes it was not a named season alone, but a certain quality of night that carried the sign, a stillness in the air, a moon riding low and pale over the fields, dew silvering the grass so brightly that the whole meadow seemed lit from below. In such hours the land itself appeared to wait. The fairy forts were believed to awaken then, though not in any coarse or earthly way. No bank of earth lifted, no doorway swung wide upon visible hinges. Yet the old circles, so silent by day, seemed to gather another kind of presence around them after dark. Their roundness deepened. Their shadows did not lie quite as other shadows lay. The thorn tree beside the ring, still in the night air, yet appeared less like a tree alone and more like a sentinel keeping watch over something inward and bright. A person looking from a cottage window towards such a place might feel, without knowing why, that the field was no longer empty. There were tellings of soft lights seen near the forts, not lantern light, for no hand carried them, not the wavering yellow of a cottage candle, nor the cold, steady beam of any later invention. These lights were spoken of as pale and wandering, like little blooms of moonlight moving close to the ground, or as a glow so gentle it scarcely seemed separate from the night itself. One might glimpse such a brightness near the bank of a fairy fort, or drifting between an old thorn and the curve of the ring, or passing slowly across a field where no path could be seen in daylight. Those who told of it did so carefully, never insisting too hard, only saying that there are nights when the eye catches something the mind cannot easily hold. And there was music too in some accounts, not always heard clearly. More often it was sensed at the edge of hearing, as though the air itself had taken on a shape of melody too delicate to be followed. A harp far off, a note like singing drawn thin and silver over the grass, a rhythm softer than footsteps and yet suggesting motion. Those who had stood late in a yard beneath the stars with the house quiet behind them and the fields stretching dark beyond the gate, sometimes said that the night near a fairy fort was never wholly silent on such evenings. Something moved through it, not in haste, not in threat, in grace. It was believed then that the she passed more freely from hall to hall beneath the land. The hidden paths that by day lay folded and unseen through field and hill were thought to stir with movement in those hours. The old forts became not merely circles in the grass, but points of nearness, where the hidden roads rose close to the upper world. Between one ancient ring and another, between one thorn tree and a distant hill, an unseen passage might grow active under moonlight. The air above it remained outwardly calm, and yet the old mind of the countryside felt there was traffic there, not of wheels or hooves, but of another company entirely. That is why people kept their distance. A door might be barred a little earlier. A child called in before the last of the light had gone. A journey along a certain lane postponed until morning, though the night seemed fair enough for walking. It was not terror that moved them. It was a kind of careful courtesy. When another world draws close, one does not stand in its way. One lets the hidden pass unhindered. The living had their hearths, their byres, their roads and rooms. The she had their own ways. On nights when the veil grew thin, wisdom lay in keeping to one's place and allowing the old passages their freedom. I remember hearing of a man who, returning late from a distant holding, saw movement across a field where no one should have been. The moon was bright enough for the walls and gates to show plain, and he knew the ground well. Yet near the fairy fort by the western boundary, he saw what seemed at first like a line of brightness, not fixed, but gently moving, as if several pale lights were crossing one after another in silence. He stopped on the lane and did not call out, nor did he step into the field. He only stood with one hand on the top stone of the wall, watching until the lights passed beyond the ring and were no longer seen. When he spoke of it later, he offered no grand claims. He only said, "There was a crossing there that night." That is how such things were remembered. Not as spectacle, but as moments when the ordinary field revealed its deeper layer. A ring fort under starlight, a thorn tree holding still against the sky, a far music too faint to follow, a pale glow passing where no lantern walked, the dream of another country rising close beneath the grass, and always the feeling that the hidden world, though usually folded inward and kept apart, had leaned near enough for its presence to be felt. These nights did not break the peace of the countryside, they deepened it. The streams still moved softly under their banks, the cattle still breathed in their sheds, ash settled in the hearth. The moon crossed the sky with slow and silver patience. Yet all of it seemed touched by a finer layer of meaning, as if the visible world were briefly lit from below by the radiance of what lay beneath. The fairy forts, so quiet by day, stood then like listening places, their old earth holding the hush of thresholds. And when morning came, the veil drew close again. The fields returned to dew and birdsong. The roads looked plain and harmless in the pale gold of dawn. The ringfoot remained only a green circle under the wide sky. Yet those who'd known such nights, or heard of them from careful voices, would look upon the old places differently afterward. For they understood that there are hours when the earth remembers more openly, and when the hidden halls of the Sidhe send a little of their light, their music and their motion upward through the sleeping fields of Ireland. There is a kind of reverence that can outlive the reason first given for it. So it was in the countryside with the fairy forts. The years moved on, as years always do. Roads were widened in places, old cottages fell, and new houses rose with straighter walls and brighter panes. Gates changed from timber to iron. Fields were drained, hedges cut back, roofs patched with newer materials than the old hands would have known. Voices changed too, and ways of speaking. Some of the older words grew rarer on the tongue. Some of the stories were told less often by the fire. Children went farther from the fields in their thoughts than their grandparents ever had. And yet, through all this quiet changing, the old rings remained much as they had been, still lying in the grass like thoughts the land had never ceased to think, while people continued to leave them alone. Not always because they could explain why. That is one of the gentlest mysteries of such places. A man might say little of the Sidhe and speak instead of weather, cattle prices, broken machinery, or the lateness of spring. A woman might know the old warnings but repeat them only half in passing, as though they were no more than habit. A child might hear that one should not meddle with the fort in the far field without ever being given the full old tale behind it. Yet the fort was still spared. The thorn was still left standing. The stones were not taken. The plough turned aside just as it had turned aside for generations. There are customs that survive in the hand even when they grow faint in the speech. The countryside is full of such things. A gate is latched a certain way because it was always latched so. Seed is sown in one field before another, because that is how the ground seems to answer best. A bucket is left by a well in a particular place, because every hand that ever reached for it learned the same motion. These acts become a kind of memory passing through the body. They need no argument. They live by repetition, by quiet trust, by the weight of many seasons laid one upon another. So too with the fairy forts. Even when belief softened at the edges, respect remained clear. I have known fields where the grass around an old ring was rich and untouched, though the rest of the pasture bore the daily signs of use. Cattle grazed the outer ground, yet the fort itself kept its own hush. I've seen a boundary wall mended stone by stone until it reached the edge of a fairy ring, and there the line bent neatly away, leaving the old curve unbroken. I've seen hawthorn branches flower over an earthen bank while nearby hedges were cut hard for winter, and no blade had been raised against the tree. The visible world gave witness to an invisible courtesy. Sometimes the people spoke of it lightly. "Oh, that place was always left. You'd not want to be troubling that thorn. My father never touched the old ring, nor his father before him." Such sayings might be offered with a half-smile, as though one need not press the matter too solemnly. But even in the lightness there was firmness. The old respect had not gone. It had only become part of the countryside's ordinary wisdom, worn smooth by time like a stone in a stream. And perhaps that is how the deepest traditions endure, not by being proclaimed loudly, but by settling so thoroughly into daily life that they no longer appear separate from it. The fairy fort was not always discussed as a matter of great mystery. Often it was simply there, in the field beyond the lane, part of the arrangement of things. Yet its presence continued to shape decisions. A track would not be cut through it. A machine would not level it. A solitary thorn rising from its bank would remain untouched year after year. Belief may have changed its clothing, but the old courtesy still walked beneath. For the land itself has a way of teaching remembrance. A person may forget a story in words, yet remember it in feeling. Stand beside a fairy fort at evening. When the low sun has turned the stone walls amber and the shadows of the hedges stretch long across the fields, and something in the place still speaks without speaking. The grass gathers softly upon the bank. Birds settle in the nearby thorn. A stream, somewhere unseen, moves with a cool and patient voice through reeds and roots. In such an hour the old ring does not appear empty. It appears held by time, by silence, by all the generations that chose not to break its curve. That feeling passes into people more deeply than they know. Even those who might call the old stories only stories often step more gently near such places. They do not always name the reason. It is enough that the place seems older than explanation. A field can be described in acreage, soil, drainage, and yield. But the fort within it belongs to another measure. It carries not only earth but atmosphere, not only grass but memory. A person standing there senses, however faintly, that this ground has been spared for longer than any one lifetime, and that such sparing itself has become a kind of truth. There were years when much else changed quickly. Machines came where once there had been horse and hand. New roads straightened old bends. Fields once divided into many small holdings were gathered into larger stretches. Concrete appeared where timber had stood. The very sound of the countryside altered in places. Yet even then, amid all that practical change, the fairy forts often remained as small islands of older regard. One might see fresh-cut silage in ordered lines, shining sheds near the yard, and beyond them, in a corner of the pasture, the old ring lying untouched under a lone hawthorn tree. It was as if the modern world, arriving with all its urgency, still lowered its voice a little before those ancient circles. That, too, is a kind of testimony. Not every tradition survives in books or in careful telling. Some are carried by the landscape itself. A child grows up seeing that no one cuts the hawthorn by the fort. The child does not ask every day why. It is simply known. Years pass. The child becomes the one deciding where a fence should go, where a drain should run, where stones might be taken. And the old ring is still left alone. In this way the land instructs the living through what has been preserved upon it. So the quiet respect endured. Not perfect everywhere, for human forgetting is real and time does alter all things, but enough endured that the fairy fort still lay in their fields, green and rounded, beneath the changing skies of Ireland. Enough endured that the old custom could still be felt in the bent path, the spared tree, the unbroken bank, the untaken stone. Enough endured that the countryside did not wholly lose its older manners, and perhaps that is because some places ask to be remembered in more than one way. The mind may forget what the feet still honour. The tongue may fall silent where the hand remains careful. The tale may fade, but the turning aside continues. Thus the forts endured through centuries not only in folklore, but in the lived tenderness of those who worked the land around them. Even when the names grew dimmer, even when belief thinned like mist after sunrise, the reverence remained in gesture and choice. The old rings were still given their space, the hawthorn still stood, the earth was left unbroken. And so one comes at last to understand that some traditions survive because the people remember, while others survive because the land remembers through them. The fairy forts of Ireland lie quietly under grass and weather, carrying both kinds of memory at once. The human memory, softened and passed from generation to generation, and the deeper memory of the earth itself, which never forgot that these places were meant to remain untouched beneath the wide and patient sky. There is a patience in the Irish land that outlasts all hurry. It has watched many things come and go, long before the roads were laid in their present lines, before bridges of stone crossed the streams, before walls were mortared and fields were measured with the neatness of later centuries. The old circles were already resting in the grass. They lay upon hillsides and within low pastures, beside quiet lanes and under changing skies, holding their rounded silence while the world around them altered again and again. Kingdoms rose and fell as all kingdoms do. Standards were lifted on windy heights. Names of lords and chieftains were spoken with power in their day. Horses crossed the ridges. Horns sounded in cold morning air. Great houses were held, lost and held again. The boundaries of rule shifted like shadow over water. A place that belonged to one family in one age belonged to another in the next. Oaths were sworn beneath rafters now long turned back into dust. Fires were lit in halls whose stones lie scattered in grass or sunk beneath ivy and moss. Yet through all those passings, the fairy forts remained. They did not move with power. They did not change allegiance. They didn't bend themselves to the concerns of one ruler or another. While human hands reached for dominion, the old circles lay close to the earth, neither declaring themselves nor disappearing. Rain fell upon them. Frost silvered their banks. The swallows returned over them each spring. The moon crossed above them in its slow and changeless course. They were not outside time, but they endured it with a calm that made the rise and fall of human things seem almost brief by comparison. Roads came later, as roads must. Some were no more than old tracks deepened by foot and hoof, worn slowly into the remembering ground. Others grew broader, harder, more deliberate, carrying carts, riders, traders, priests, soldiers, and all the restless purposes of the living. Stone was laid where mud had long ruled. Bridges were shaped across running water. Gates were hung where once there had only been openings in hedges or gaps in walls. The world became more connected in its visible ways, and still the fairy forts kept their own still map beneath it all. Many a road bent around an ancient ring. Many a path, though shorter routes were possible, seemed to choose the longer kindness. A traveller might think this no more than the shape of the land, and perhaps that was true in one sense. For the land and its memory are not separate things. A curve in the road may be practical, but it may also be reverent. A field boundary may follow the convenience of drainage, but it may also honour a silence older than ploughing. So the countryside changed, and yet kept making room. It laid down its new lines without erasing all the old ones. The centuries passed over Ireland like weather over pasture. There were seasons of plenty and lean years both. Bells rang from monasteries. Then other bells rang from other towers. New prayers were spoken. New laws were imposed. New forms of keeping land and naming it came and settled over old places. Languages mingled. Old words faded from some mouths and lingered in others. Families stayed for generations and then were gone. Children were born, grew, worked, married, aged, and returned to the ground. Through it all, the same ancient circles remained in the fields, quiet as ever, their banks grassy, their thorn trees blossoming and buried in their seasons. A fort seen by one shepherd 500 years ago may still be seen by another now, though everything else about the life around it has altered. The sheep are different. The walls are repaired in new places. The cottage nearby may have fallen and been replaced. The road beyond may carry wheels no earlier century would have known. Yet the old ring is still there, perhaps a little lower under time, perhaps thick with moss in a way it once was not, perhaps holding a lone hawthorn grown older, more bent, more full of weather, but still there with the same inward quality, the same sense that it belongs not only to the visible field but to a deeper continuity the land has never let go. There is something moving in that thought. Human beings remember in fragments. We keep names, stories, songs, broken heirlooms, old family habits, a prayer learned from a grandmother, the way a father opened a gate or touched the brim of his hat at a holy place. But the land remembers differently. It remembers by holding shape, by letting certain places remain, by allowing grass to cover what should be softened and silence to deepen around what should not be broken. The fairy forts are part of that larger remembrance. They are memory made visible, not through inscription or proclamation, but through endurance. I have stood in fields where the evening light lay low and golden across the stubble, and the ancient ring at the far end of the field seemed at first no more than a rise in the earth. Then, after a while, it gathered itself in the eye. The curve became clear. The shadow inside the bank deepened. A bird rose from the thorn tree beside it and crossed toward the west. Far off, a dog barked once. Somewhere down the lane a gate clanged shut. The ordinary world continued in all its familiar sounds. Yet the old fort held another kind of stillness, as though it were not merely present in the evening but looking through it. That is how the ancient hills still watch. Not with eyes, of course, nor with any restless intention. Their watching is the watching of endurance, the watching of things that have remained while generations have passed like mist over the low fields at dawn. The fairy forts do not judge the living. They simply remain, and in remaining they remind. They remind the countryside that not all that is old has vanished. They remind the people that memory can live in the shape of the land itself. They remind the mind, if it grows quiet enough, that beneath the ordinary life of roads and roofs and changing names, there is an older layer still resting in place. And so the fields continue around them. Grass grows and is cut. Cattle graze and move on. Rain darkens the stones in the walls. Blackberries gather in the hedges. Morning comes pale and pearl-coloured over the far hills. Night returns with its cool blue hush and the first small stars. The old circles stay where they have always stayed. Kingdom after kingdom has passed into silence. Road after road has been drawn and redrawn. Voices once powerful are gone into the wind. But the fairy forts remain under weather and season, under skylark song and winter frost, holding their patient shape in the open country. They are among the quietest things in the landscape, and yet among the most enduring. The land still keeps them, as if unwilling to surrender the last visible traces of some ancient inward life. Perhaps that is why they seem so moving in the late hour of day, when light fades from the fields and the world grows softer at the edges. The eye sees a green ring under the sky. The deeper mind feels something older, a continuity without haste, a listening without voice, a long still presence that has outlived ambition, outlived road-making, outlived the noise of passing ages. Thus, the countryside of Ireland, for all its changes, still carries its ancient circles. They lie in the fields as they have long lain, modest to the casual glance, profound to the remembering heart. The hills still hold them, the grass still covers them, the thorn trees still lean near them in blossom and in berry, and through their quiet endurance, the land goes on telling its oldest truth, that beneath all human change there remains an older belonging, calm and watchful, resting in the earth and waiting beneath the wide and patient sky. There is an hour in the Irish countryside when the day does not so much end as loosen its hold upon the fields. It comes softly. The light begins to thin over the distant land, and the brightness that had rested all afternoon on stone wall and pasture fades into something gentler, more inward, as though the world were drawing a quiet breath before night. The road beneath your feet is narrow, edged with grasses that lean into it from either side. Here and there, small white flowers still hold a little gleam. The ditches are darkening now, and the slow water within them carries the last pale stripe of sky between roots and reeds. Far off, where the land lifts into mild and ancient rises, the fields become a patchwork of dim green and deepening shadow. To walk at such an hour is to feel the countryside changing around you in a way that cannot be hurried. The birds are not silent yet, though their songs are fewer than they were in the long gold of late afternoon. A blackbird gives one clear note from a hedgerow and then another, as if testing the evening. Somewhere a rook crosses overhead, the beat of its wings slow and measured against the fading light. From a farther field comes the dull, mild sound of cattle moving, not with any urgency, but with the quiet shifting of creatures settling themselves before the night cools the grass. The air is full of small, fading motions, leaves turning lightly against one another, water slipping under a low stone culvert, the soft brush of your coat against the hedge as the lane narrows and bends, and beyond the wall to your left, in a field already gathering dusk, lies the fairy fort. At first it is only a shape among shapes. The field is broad, and the light is lowering so gently that edges are becoming uncertain. The wall that runs beside the road has old stones in it, grey and weathered, some furred with moss, some touched by the faint silver of lichen. Beyond it the pasture stretches quiet and open, and there, not too far from the wall, rises the low round swell of the fort. Grass covers it deeply. The bank is soft with age. A shadow seems to rest within the curve more fully than in the rest of the field, though the evening light still lingers above it. Beside the ring stands the hawthorn. It is alone. That loneliness belongs to it in a way that does not seem sorrowful, only right. No other tree stands close by. The field around it is wide and clean in its openness, yet the hawthorn keeps its place as though it has no need of company. Its trunk is dark in the dusk, not large, yet full of the patient strength of things that have stood many winters in wind and rain. The branches spread and twist in quiet intricacy. In daylight one might notice every thorn, every leaf, every berry or blossom depending on the season. But now the tree is becoming a single dark grace against the evening sky, its shape delicate and watchful all at once. You slow your step without quite deciding to. There are places that ask this of a person, not by command, not even by any clear intention. It is only that the body seems to understand what the mind has not yet named. The foot falls more softly on the road, the breath quiets, the gaze lingers. The ordinary habit of walking with destination in mind gives way to another manner of moving, gentler and more attentive, as if the hour itself had become a kind of threshold. The fairy fort lies under the deepening sky, as though it has always lain there, and perhaps that is why such places move the heart so quietly. They seem older than effort, older than the road beneath your feet, older than the wall stone lifted and laid by careful hands, older even than the names of fields and families. The grass upon the bank is not merely grass then, It is a soft covering over long remembrance. The curve of the earth is not merely shape, but a held silence. Looking upon it, you feel not that something has vanished, but that something remains, though it remains inwardly, withdrawn beneath root and soil and time. The hawthorn beside it deepens that feeling. There it stands, where countless evenings must have found it through the generations, under summer dusk and winter dusk, under rain that blurred the field to silver, under clear skies where the first stars shone hard and bright above the darkening land. It has watched cattle graze and roads weather, watched walls mended and remade, watched children become old and old voices pass from the world. And still it keeps its place by the fort, as if set there to mark the nearness of something the eye alone cannot fully measure. The light lowers further. The west now is pale gold fading to pearl, and above that a tender blue, growing deeper with every quiet moment. The field loses detail and gains atmosphere. The grass no longer shows each blade, but lies in a broad hush, like green velvet going slowly to shadow. The bank of the fort becomes clearer in its roundness even as its surface grows less distinct, for dusk has a way of gathering meaning into shape. The hawthorn, too, stands more fully now as silhouette than tree, and yet its presence is no less living for that. If anything, it is more so. A dark sign, a rooted stillness, a companion to the old ring. You pause by the wall. One hand may come to rest upon the top stone, cool with the day's last stored chill. Moss gives a little beneath the fingers. The road behind and before you is empty. No wheel passes. No human voice comes near. The countryside seems to widen in its silence, until the field, the fort, the tree, the sky, and the faint line of hills beyond all belong to one continuous stillness. Even the sounds that remain are quieter now. A final bird call from somewhere near the stream, the low shifting of cattle farther off, the almost unheard movement of evening air through hedge leaves, and in that stillness there comes the old feeling, not fear, never that if the place is met rightly, rather a sense of ancient nearness, a sense that beneath the grass, beneath the rounded bank, beneath the roots of the hawthorn, there lies a depth not measured by spade or by footsteps. The old tales rise easily in such an hour, not as stories pressed upon the mind, but as natural companions to what the place already seems to say. That something rests below, something hidden and patient, something not gone from the world, only kept within the earth's inward chambers. The fairy fort does not announce this, it only holds it. Its silence is the silence of a door closed gently, not of a place emptied and forgotten. The grass lies over it like a coverlet. The shadows gather along its curve. The hawthorn stands above like a quiet sentinel. And the heart, growing still in the dusk, can imagine without strain that there is indeed another life beneath that field, older and finer than the visible one. A hidden hall, a resting brightness, a company that does not hurry with the fading day but remains in its own calm season under the land. Night is not yet come, but it is near. A star appears over the farthest ridge, small and clear. The gold in the west withdraws. The fort grows darker, the thorn more slender against the sky. Soon the road will ask to be followed onward, and the cottage lights in distant places will begin to shine through hedges and beyond bends in the lane. But for this moment, standing quietly beside the wall with the fairy fort before you, the whole countryside seems suspended between worlds, the visible world of stone and road and pasture, and the older inward world resting beneath the grass. You do not need to see more than this: the shape of the ring, the dark grace of the hawthorn, the soft evening air, the sense that the earth here is not empty but listening. And then, after a long still moment, you walk on, carrying with you the hush of that place, while behind you in the fading field the ancient fort remains beneath the dusk, silent as ever, keeping its old mystery under the gathering night. Night comes gently to the Irish fields. It does not fall all at once, nor does it arrive with any sharp dividing line. It gathers itself slowly over the land, as though drawn out of the hollows and hedges, out of the streams that move quietly beneath alder roots, out of the long grass bending under dew. The last of the evening light thins along the west, pale as worn silver, and the hills begin to darken in their folds and shoulders. Stone walls lose their harder edges. The roads grow softer where they wind between banks of fern and thorn. Far fields, which only a little while ago lay open in green and gold, now seem to recede into a hush too wide for easy naming. At such an hour the countryside becomes simpler and deeper. What remains visible is enough. The slope of a pasture, the black outline of a tree, the faint white of a gate where the road turns, the shape of a roof far off, holding the last trace of sky above it. And among these things, as quietly as ever, the fairy forts remain where they have always remained, their round banks lying in the darkened grass beneath the broadening night. There is something in the stillness of those old places that belongs especially to the evening. By day one sees them among the common forms of the world. They are part of the land then, though set apart within it. The grass is plain, the bank discernible, the thorn tree near at hand. But when night begins to settle, the fairy forts seem to draw farther inward, becoming less like shapes in a field and more like silences the earth has chosen to keep. The darkness does not hide them completely, or rather it gathers around them in such a way that their quiet presence becomes stronger. A ring of earth beneath starlight is a small thing to the eye, and yet to the inward feeling it may seem vast with memory. The stars begin one by one. First a single brightness over the farther hills, then another above the dark ridge beyond the fields, and then a handful scattered higher where the blue of the sky has deepened toward black. Their light is clear and ancient. It falls over the countryside without haste, touching roof and road, tree and stream, stone wall and sleeping pasture alike. The same stars look down upon the fairy forts, and perhaps that is part of the deep peace they carry. They are not separate from the heavens above them. They rest under the same patient sky that watched the first hands raise their banks, yet the same sky that watched the rings fall silent, the same sky that now holds them in its cool and endless regard. The fields themselves grow stiller as night advances. The cattle settle. The birds are done with song. A stream may still be heard in some hidden place, though even its voice seems lower than before, as if it too has entered the hush. Along the hedges the leaves scarcely stir. The grass holds the first wetness of dew. In low meadows a pale dimness gathers, not quite mist, and not yet shadow alone, but something between. The world is not empty then. It is simply quiet enough for older things to be felt. So much of the land's remembering is held this way, not in speech, not in carved stone, not in any record opened before the eye. It is held in silence, in a field left unbroken, in a thorn tree standing alone, in a curve of earth that no hand has levelled, in the instinct by which a person, passing at the close of day, lowers the voice or slows the step without quite knowing why. The old stories of the countryside live in such gestures, but they also live beyond them, folded into the very stillness of the land itself. For silence is never truly empty in Ireland's old places. It has depth, as water has depth. It has texture, as moss has texture upon stone. Stand long enough beside a fairy fort at night, and the quiet begins to feel layered. There is the quiet of the visible field, where no movement now crosses the grass. Beneath that is another quiet, older and more inward, as though the earth were resting over something it has no wish to surrender to daylight. And deeper still, if the heart is calm enough to sense it, thus. There is the quiet of remembered belief, of all the generations that looked upon such a place and felt it belonged to a mystery that should be honoured by leaving it alone. The hills keep this silence well. Under starlight their forms are broad and solemn, neither sad nor stern, only enduring. They lie beyond the fields as they have always lain, holding streams in their folds, old paths on their sides, and hidden hollows where shadows deepen early. Among them and beneath them, the fairy forts rest unnoticed by many, yet never absent. It is a strange comfort to think how long these circles have lain beneath the same night sky, receiving frost and moonlight, rain and dawn, season after season, century after century, while human voices came and went like passing wind. And perhaps the land prefers it so, and stories told too loudly lose something of their root. But stories kept in the grain of a place, in the hush between hill and field, in the untouched bank and the uncut thorn, seem to grow gentler and stronger with time. The fairy forts do not insist on being explained. They do not ask to be solved. They remain simply as they are, and because they remain, the old story continues. The grass says part of it. The stars say part of it. The road bending away says part of it. The rest is carried in silence. I have often thought that this is the true wisdom of the old countryside, that it understood how to keep company with mystery without breaking it open. A stream can be crossed without being emptied. A tree can be passed without being harmed. A field can be worked without every corner yielding itself to use. Now, so too the fairy forts could be lived beside without being made ordinary. They stayed under the care of distance, under the courtesy of custom, under the quiet recognition that some places belong as much to memory as to soil. And in the night, when all practical things are stilled for a few hours and the world grows simple again beneath the stars, that recognition seems truer than ever. The forts lie then in their deep silence. No lamp burns on their banks. No foot disturbs the grass. The hawthorn near them stands dark and motionless. Above, the constellations turn in their slow and glittering order. Beyond, the hills keep watch in shadow, and through all of it the land holds its old stories, not speaking them, but carrying them with a steadiness that feels older than language itself. So night passes over the fields. And the fairy forts remain. They remain under the dew. They remain under the starlight. They remain under the long breath of the dark. And though no voice may be heard upon the road, and no tale spoken beside the hearth just then, the land goes on remembering in its own profound and gentle way. It remembers through stillness, through endurance, through the silent keeping of ancient circles beneath the sky. In that silence there is no loneliness. There is only depth, the depth of the earth, the depth of the hills, the depth of time resting softly under grass and thorn and stars. And the old forts, lying within that vast hush, seem less like ruins than like thoughts. The land continues to think, even in darkness, even in stillness, even now. There are hills in Ireland that seem never to have forgotten anything. They rise softly from the fields, not with the sternness of mountains, but with the patient shape of old thoughts resting beneath the sky. Their sides are green with pasture and fern, with stone walls running across them in pale lines, with sheep paths threading lightly where generations of small hooves have gone. Streams slip from their folds and move quietly through rush and moss before finding their way into wider waters. Hawthorns stand in certain places as though appointed there long ago, and the roads, winding among them, seem less like things imposed upon the land than things allowed by it. In such country, the old circles remain. They lie where they have lain through the passing of so many years that the mind grows still trying to measure them. In open fields where cattle graze under a pearl-coloured morning, beside narrow lanes where the hedges flower in one season and redden with berries in another, on low rises touched first by the evening sun, near small streams where willow roots drink in silence, under winter frost, under summer dew, under the silver turning of moonlight and the slow procession of stars, the ancient rings remain, and still they keep their inward hush. A person may walk a long road in the countryside and see many ordinary things, gates hanging a little crooked on their hinges, a bucket left by a pump, the black line of rooks crossing home against the late sky, smoke lifting from a chimney when the day is cooling, the shine of rain-water in wagon ruts, the dark sweetness of earth after a soft shower. And all these things belong to the common and beloved life of the land. Yet among them, when one comes upon a fairy fort lying in a nearby field, there is often the old feeling again. That sense that the place is not merely there, but abiding. Not only visible, but keeping something. Perhaps they are only forgotten earthworks. Perhaps they are no more than the worn remains of old enclosures, left by lives long folded back into the soil. The sheltering rings of households whose fires have long since gone cold. The softened banks of old farmsteads, where cattle once breathed in their pens and children once ran across yards now green with grass. The mind may think this, and there is gentleness in the thought. For even so, the places would still be full of human nearness, of the labour and tenderness of ordinary people who made their homes close to one another and close to the earth. But perhaps they are more. Perhaps the old countryside knew what it was saying all along when it spoke softly of the she, of hidden roads, of hawthorn guardians, of halls beneath the hills where music lingers beyond the reach of daylight. Perhaps the fairy forts truly do belong to an older world resting within this one, folded under the grass and stone, under the fields and walls and cattle paths, quiet but not empty. Perhaps the rounded banks are coverings only, soft lids over doorways not wholly closed. Perhaps beneath them the hidden realm still breathes in its own calm season, while above it the human world passes and passes again. The land does not hurry to answer. That is part of its wisdom. The Irish countryside has never been eager to explain away its mysteries. It holds them with the same patience with which it holds water in shaded wells, or moss upon north-facing stones, or dew upon the meadow in the first thin light of dawn. It lets things remain. A ring of earth in a field, a lone thorn beside it, a path bending away without any clear practical reason, is silence deepening at dusk where the visible world seems to end and something older begins to lean close. The land keeps these things without argument. It leaves them to the heart, and the heart, if it grows quiet enough, often understands more than the mind can settle. To stand beside one of those old circles in the late hour of day is to feel how gently time may rest upon a place. The grass moves a little in the evening air. The hills darken toward blue. A stream somewhere below the field keeps its patient voice among the roots. The first stars appear, one by one, above the broadening dusk. Near the ancient ring the hawthorn stands, branch and thorn and silence, as it has stood through so many seasons of blossom and berry that the years themselves seem small beside it. Nothing stirs, nothing declares itself, and yet the place feels full of memory, full of old regard, full of the unbroken courtesy by which generations chose to leave such places in peace. That may be the deepest thing of all, not whether every tale told of the forts is literally so, but that the land and the people together agreed, over a very long time, that some places should remain untouched. In that agreement there is something beautiful, something tender. The old rings were spared because they seemed to belong to more than use, and by being spared they gathered more and more of that belonging, until the quiet itself became a kind of inheritance. Even now, when so many other things change quickly, the thought endures. The fields go on, the roads go on, rain falls on the stone walls and sun dries them again. Lambs are born in spring and stand uncertainly in the grass. Swallows return under wide summer skies. Autumn lays its berries bright in the thorn. Winter hardens the gates with frost before dawn. And through all this turning, the fairy forts remain where they have always remained, holding their round stillness under weather and starlight. So perhaps it is enough simply to leave them there in the mind as they are in the land. Ancient circles in quiet fields. Old earthen rings beneath the passing sky. Places where the visible world grows thinner and the inward world draws near. Places that may be only old earthworks, or maybe doorways to something older and finer beneath the hills. The countryside does not force us to choose. It only asks that we look gently and listen, for the land remembers in ways people do not. People forget names, forget stories, forget why a tree was spared or why a path was left to curve. Voices fade, houses fall. The hands that once pointed toward a distant fort and lowered their tone are long at rest beneath churchyard grass. Yet the land goes on remembering. It remembers through shape, through silence, through the old ring still visible at evening, through the hawthorn still standing alone, through the unease of a hand that does not wish to disturb what has been left undisturbed for so long, and that may be the final gift of such places. They remind us that forgetting is never complete, while the earth still holds the mark. The hills remember, the fields remember, the grass remembers what lies beneath it, and in the quiet of Ireland, where dusk settles softly over stone wall and pasture and ancient ring, the old stories remain, even after the last voice has fallen silent, resting gently in the land, waiting under the patient sky, and fading at last into the deep and peaceful hush from which they first arose.